morning. Let's get started. This is our inaugural event for the year, and I'm delighted to have Lindsey Pullum back at Sesame. We had the great pleasure of having worked very closely with her in her first incarnation as a graduate student in NELC. And here she is back again to kick us off for this year. She's a native of North Carolina and graduated from North Carolina State University, where my father taught in the School of Engineering before I was born, with a BA in Political Science and a minor in Middle Eastern Studies. She continued her studies here, as I mentioned a moment ago, and received her master's in 2014 from our good friends in NELC. She participated in the Swiss Arabic Summer Language Program and led the Model Arab League debate team, which won, in fact, which was our first year that we participated. We've been doing that, I think, ever since, but it was actually the first year we participated. And we won, I think each of our committees won awards, all of our people won awards, and we won overall best team, and that was all thanks to you. I should take credit for that, but I can't with her sitting here. So, but she has also served as the NELC Graduate Student Association president during both years when she was a graduate student there. Now a third-year PhD student in the Department of Anthropology with a concentration in communication, media, and performance studies and a minor in Jewish studies. Her research interests include Israel studies, minority representations in Israel, identity construction, performance studies, ethnography of media, language and media ideologies, multilingualism, and tourism studies. Please join me in welcoming her. Thank
you. You know, when the ambassador reads off all your research interests, you know you should probably limit them eventually. But that's what this year's about. So thank you again, Sesame, for having me. I'm super excited to present this. It's a project I started working on about a year and a half ago with one of my advisors. I was really interested in film, and I just couldn't find an intersection for where I wanted to explore how MIZRAHI or Arab Jews, Sephardic Jews were being portrayed, sort of in media and in performance. So this project comes out of a class with Aziza Khazzoum, who specializes in MIZRAHI communities and in sociology of Israel. So,
who was on Sesame Higher, I should say. We used Title VI funds to get Aziza here. That should be recalled. Anyway, sorry, I don't know.
Good to know.
We used seed money to get her here from Title VI.
So, Baghdad, 1950. The state of Israel in its infancy and across the region, Jews were being forced to decide between home and homeland. For many, the distinction between the two was blurred. Blurred because identities and loyalties, both national and religious, conflicted with one another, which sets the stage for our film, The Dove Flyer. The film follows Kabi, an Iraqi Jew living in Baghdad with his family. Kabi, not a boy, not yet a man, finds himself torn between his Iraqi and Jewish loyalties. He's enlisted and encouraged and influenced by those closest to him to choose whichever side they belong to in terms of their Iraqi Jewish identity. In one scene, Kabi finds himself smuggling arms for the Zionist underground, seen as a direct threat to the Iraqi government, and in the next, Kabi is being employed and nurtured by an Iraqi Jew who wishes to maintain Jewish credibility and loyalty to the state. Kabi's struggle to decide what he believes to be right for him and for his community is a metaphorical performance of the mindset of those living in Iraq at the time. The Dove Flyer then takes a deeper and darker look at the reality faced by many Jews from across the Middle East, or MIZRAHI Jews. So historically, Jews in countries surrounding Israel, Palestine, enjoyed high positions in society and in government. With pressure and manipulation from both their home countries and Israel, most Jews were evicted from their homelands by force. So in this essay, this talk I'll give for you today, I specifically look at Iraqi Jewish identity and immigration to the state in post-1948. Narratives of Ashkenazim or Eastern European Jews remain relatively well known. Some of us, it's the first story we hear. But equally as important are the stories of MIZRAHI Jews. So today I'll historically contextualize the narrative of Iraqi Jews and their expulsion from Iraq. Then I'm going to use original ethnographic data to talk about how narratives like the ones we see in the Dove Flower get re-intextualized in popular culture discourse and circulation, namely film festivals in America. I conduct only 3 interviews with film festival directors and coordinators, but the idea is to answer the question, what's at stake in including Mizrahi narratives within this broader Jewish-Israeli cinematic context. So based on my research, I can conclude that the inclusion of these stories directly correlates with the ideological framework that the film festival aligns itself. These ideological frames depend mainly on larger organizational structures and affiliations, audience subjectivity, and which films are eligible or not for consideration based on these primary points. Those in charge of film festivals find the stories of Mizrahim or Sephardic Jews important to understanding identity of self and of other, and multicultural exchanges, but the inclusion of this genre of story is contingent on funding, on timing, and popularity with their audience, and within the State of Israel. So to accommodate these varying ideological frames, the Dove Flyer's image changes to meet the conditions of each of these radically different environments. So ideally, we would watch the trailer together, but since we don't have any internet, I'll just let you Google it in your free time or on your smartphone now. But the idea is it's set in post-48 Iraq. It's a coming-of-age story during a time of expulsion, or just before the expulsion of Iraqi Jews. And it's based on the book that Eli Amir writes, and it's shot entirely in Arabic, which is pretty significant. So the film first starts out as, it's got 2 different names, right? So even in thinking about how we call it, it's already a political decision. So you could call it Mafriya Hayonim in Hebrew, or Mutir al-Hamam in Arabic. But the film is released in 2014, based off of the autobiographical accounts that Eli Amir had when he was a boy, experiencing the expulsion of his family and friends. Now, when you Google search this, or if you look it up on IMDb or Wikipedia, you can only find it, or at least its original form, as Farewell Baghdad, which is not in either of the translations of Hebrew or Arabic. So I refer to the film solely as the Dove Flyer, but you'll note that if you go anywhere else to find it, it has a secondary name, which we'll talk about why that's important. All right, so it's based off of a real account. In a press release in May 20th of 2014, the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs noted that what's unique about this film is that the actors speak almost entirely in Iraqi Arabic dialects, spoken by the Jews and Muslims of Baghdad. So we've got a different name, we're in a different language, and we're already starting to associate with different geographical locations and different people in the region. So the film shows multiple perspectives of Iraqi Jewish experience and follows closely to the historical account experienced by the author. So just to contextualize what's happening at the time. So Arab and Jewish nationalism at the time of immigration to Israel was grounded in fundamental elements of collective identity, religion, language, ethnicity. Moshe Bihar argues the combination of the actions by both Zionists and Arab forces create an unfounded equivocation of Jew with Zionist, which is a problem if you're a Jew living in the state of Iraq. Right? This conflation added to the expulsion of Iraqi Jews because they were seen as an existential threat to the Iraqi nation state. They didn't fit either category. They were Jewish and they were Arab. They were sandwiched between Zionist and Arab nationalism projects. Zionism was projected as representative of all opinions for Jews, which alienated assimilated Iraqi Jews from local society. So trapped between Zionism and Arab nationalism, Arab Jews eventually migrated to Israel due to the increased violence experienced locally. Their presence in Israel helped establish this state by adding sheer numbers of bodies, but their association with Arab, or the Arab side of their identity, reading pre-modern to those other Jews that found their way to Israel, minimalized their socio-political power within Israeli society. Meanwhile, their absence in Arab societies, or in Iraq specifically, made a closer and cohesive alignment religiously. So while the Dove Flyer doesn't show the reality faced by Iraqi Jews once in Israel, it does visualize the perceived threat of Iraqi Jews to the state, showing police raids of houses and ethnic slurs yelled at Jews in the street. So the Dove Flyer isn't entirely unique in the sense that it is a film about Mizrahi Jews, right? So back in the 1960s and 1970s, there was a previous genre of Mizrahi narratives called Bureka films. So Bureka films are it's like a play off of the dessert and the savory treat, as some of you might know. I see some smiles and nodding heads. So a bureka is a type of food, and it was used as a type of slur about films that Mizrahim Jews specifically made, that mostly focused on the discrimination and difference between Ashkenazim and Mizrahim Jews at the time. And it mostly addressed the philosophical question of who is Israeli, and why were we different if we were both Jews living in Israel. So the Dove Flyer picks up off of this tradition, but builds off of it into a different way. It's a better quality film. Mizrahi films weren't, or Bureka films weren't well funded, but Mizrahi films, at least today, are more focused on the history and the cultural context of the people they're addressing in their films. So I've sort of contextualized the historical moment we're in. We've seen a trajectory of at least what's happening in the 1950s to sort of where Mizrahi films are going today. So to highlight how I collected my data. So on one of the websites for the Dove Flyer, they list all 29 film festivals that the Dove Flyer was screened at. I mean, some of these, they're almost all either affiliated with Israeli or Jewish points of identity, right? Some of them, I think the one I was most shocked by was the ministry in Ghana screens this film, which I thought, oh, that's neat. But I focused my data collection on American film festivals to sort of combat almost the bias I had as a researcher, having only known, at least growing up in high school and early college, that Ashkenazim Jews were the only ones who came to Israel after the Holocaust. That's sort of the dominant narrative. And I feel like that's a narrative most high school students have, because whenever I tell someone who's my age or who grew up with me that I'm looking at a story about Mizrahi Jews, they don't seem to know who I'm talking about. So there's this missing piece to who makes up the Israeli population. So over the course of 3 weeks, I conducted interviews with the film festival directors of the Los Angeles Sephardic Jewish Film Festival, the Chicago Festival for Israeli Cinema, and University of Wisconsin, MADISON-HILLEL. So each of these serve as a different component of the film festivals that at least register in the United States. So one is specifically Sephardic. It's specifically tuned into Arab Jews or Spanish Jews. And when I interviewed the director for this film festival, Neil Sheff, he was really intent on me making sure that when I mentioned anything he said to emphasize Sephardic, he thought it was more inclusive to say Sephardic than Mizrahim, which Mizrah in Hebrew means east. And he thought that was too exclusionary, too prone to the actual region that would be Iraq, Palestine, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan. The second film festival, the Chicago Festival, was interesting because it's about Israeli cinema. It's not so necessarily tied to a specific identity, but a location where their films are exclusively chosen based on where they were made and who supported it in terms of the Israeli Film Fund. And lastly, UW-Madison, as random as that might sound to you, served as an interesting point of contact for a religious aspect, right? So Hillel in general are very oriented to religious education and expression of Jewish identity. And it happened to be very close to Bloomington. I will shamelessly admit it was a convenient place to call. So when thinking about my conversations with each of these three people, I thought about it in terms of framing, right? How are they looking at films when they're trying to choose them? how they conceptualize or frame their own festival, how does it align with larger organizational principles, or even their audience, right? And so I'm going off the idea that frames help us organize and understand what we see and hear into categories, into manageable, into digestible chunks, just like genres do, right? When we walk into a genre of film, at least if it's a horror film, we know we should be scared, we should probably see like blood and death, and if we're watching a romantic comedy, we're hoping to probably cry and hopefully the couple gets together at the end, right? So I'm thinking about festivals as a way to frame like these cinematic events, and I find that they're distinctly ideological, right? They're socially constructed, and they guide the selection and reception of films in that specific context. So ideology is informed by these larger organizational affiliations, by the audience demographics, and all of that sort of reflexively produces the own ideological frame, right? It's sort of this dialogic relationship. So the first film festival, right, the Sephardic Jewish Film Festival, is distinctly associated with the Sephardic Educational Center. The Sephardic Educational Center is based out of Jerusalem. Its mission statement states that the SEC is dedicated to strengthening Jewish identity for youth and young adults, and to bring a new generation of spiritual and community leaders. So if that's its mission statement, the Los Angeles Sephardic Jewish Film Festival brings these unique stories and the culture of Sephardic Jewry to the big screen. So it was established in 1997 as a new way to fundraise. So the director of the film festival, Neil Sheff, says, the sad fact is people just don't want to give money to banquets anymore. They want to do something fun and be active, right? So the film festival is used as a tool for bringing in Sephardic Jewry in the Los Angeles area. Now, what's interesting about how they contextualize this film is they call it by a different name. So at the same time that the Sephardic Jewish Film Festival is going on, so is another film festival in the area. I want to say it was the LA Israeli Film Festival. Yeah, and they were worried that when they showed the film, they wouldn't get as many people to come. So they called it something different. They called it Farewell Baghdad, because the Dove Flyer doesn't associate the film with any one community, any one geographical area. So by calling it Farewell Baghdad, they were pulling at the identity of specifically Iraqi Jews living in Israel, or living in LA. So one of his quotes to me was, "My idea was to show the Sephardic experience on screen for, on the one hand, people want to see their own experience. The experience they went through. They want to see similar experiences. They want their children also to be able to see it and kind of experience similar experiences that they went through, either leaving their countries or while they were in their countries, or some of their cultures, customs and cultures of those different backgrounds. And we'll mix it up, a little bit of representative films that Sephardic communities learn about each other, and at the same time we reach people who are not Sephardic, not even Jewish, who find it very interesting about it, like this exotic group." So what's interesting about this quote from Neil Sheff is that he's highlighting the fact that people want to see their own experiences. They want to feel nostalgic, and they want to share it with their children or their neighbors. They want to educate their children on what it was like, what it is like. This need for collective and retrieved memory is significant to appeasing and appealing the Sephardic community. Neil explains that there's a trans-ethnic, transnational exchange of experience between members of the Sephardic community across different geographical places. So showing these films in the larger context of the festival has a bigger impact on the community in the sense that there's a dialogue between communities where they can comment on experiences like, "Oh yeah, this was my experience," or "Mine was different, it was more like this." So cultural and historic differences between the diasporic communities are overcome by conversation and mutual connection. So just to jump back to the idea that we're calling it something different, we're calling it Farewell Baghdad instead of the Dove Flyer. He comments, "We were kind of worried if they were going to stage us up," they means other Israeli film festival, "if they were going to stage us up with their showing of the film. But the funny thing is that most of the people in the Iraqi Jewish community waited to see it at our festival because they wanted to see it together with their family. And so we had a line around the corner to see that film." So this is strategic in two ways. First, by changing the name to Farewell Baghdad, the Sephardic Jewish Film Festival let audience members know that what the film was generally about, something that they could immediately connect to. The Dove Flyer, being ambiguous, doesn't insinuate any sort of reference to Iraq. Yet, by even the mention of Baghdad, you semantically connect the film with Iraq and Iraqi Jews. So secondly, by referring to the film as its alternative name, they hope to appeal to the emotional connection. So we have this idea that it's connecting to identity and to some form of affect. Hoping to appeal to the emotional connection Iraqi Jews would have to the land and the experience of expulsion. Now, when Neil mentioned the Dove Flyer, I pressed him further on his insight on the presence of Iraqi Jewish narratives in film festivals, right? What's the point of adding this component? And he said, finding films on Sephardic Jews is not easy, especially feature films. Documentaries are much more readily available. And he received mostly documentary submissions for the festival that year. So I asked him, why the increase in contemporary films? He says, it's hard to call it a trend after just 1 year, but he thinks there are some stories of Sephardic Jews that, I think, lend themselves a lot more to different types of reasons why people even go to the movies. To see romance or passion or exotic places, and things you just wouldn't expect. I think that people have an idea of what an Eastern European Judaism is like, and the Holocaust has had lots of films about that. But there are very many people that don't realize there are Jews that speak Spanish or Arabic and what their experience was like. So, these stories show us new landscapes, food, clothing, language, culture. And from my interview, I gather Neil had some complicated ideas on whether people see films to see themselves, as was evident in the previous quote, or to see others. So although these films seem to be popular among Sephardic Jews for their cultural connections, its appeal to non-Sephardic Jews and non-Jews has an Orientalist slight. The exoticism of Africa or the deserts of forbidden romance in Iraq play on the historical stereotype of MIZRAHI and Sephardic Jews as seen by their dominant counterpart, or the Ashkenazim, the West. So the Sephardic Jewish Film Festival's mission is to show these stories and screen these films so that anyone can learn about the rich heritage and history that Sephardic Jews have. But the rules for choosing the films in the festival are simple. Just tell the story of the Sephardic Jew. So whether these are documentaries or feature films, it doesn't matter. The point is that they're heard, appreciated, and creating a dialogue. The Chicago Festival for Israeli Cinema does not have a larger organizational affiliation to answer to, but it does have a clear mission statement. The mission to share a love and appreciation of Israeli culture with the Jewish community and the community at large. So when I interviewed Cindy Stern, she's the executive director of the Chicago Festival for Israeli Cinema. She echoed those sentiments, stressing a significant emphasis on cultural exchange among different demographics of Jewish populations as well as the public at large. So there's, again, another emphasis on multicultural discourse, and having previously worked with the International Film Festival Series at the University of Colorado Boulder, Cindy transitioned to the CFIC to run marketing, volunteer coordinating, fundraising, and film curating, among other positions. And she expressed her own agenda for how she chooses the films, as she's the sole film curator, just like Neil Shepp is for the Sephardic Jewish Film Festival. She says, my ultimate goal, I want to make the world a better place, and the way to make the world a better place is to create an opportunity for dialogue. So the festival is specifically branded as Israeli, which is really interesting considering there are only 10 Israeli film festivals in the US versus the 70 to 80 Jewish film festivals. This implies that films shown may or may not have Jewish themes or associations, but are exclusively Israeli produced or supported. She said picking the films is like making a mixtape, or making a record album. You have to have a mix. You want a mix of sounds. I want a mix of texture. I try to program the festival as a whole to show the whole story, the full story. I take films that have won international awards, of course. Those get my #1 priority, my first priority. And then the second priority are films that have won awards in Israel. And then the third is just to try and fill in the story with current events. So the Chicago Festival emphasizes award-winning pictures that represent the multiple facets of Israeli culture, but emphasize a temporal boundary. They need to be recent. They need to be made or released within the previous 18 months in order to capture the atmosphere and attitude in Israel. Every film, she said, represents the feeling of the country within the last, let's say, 18 months. You know, the previous 18 months. So you could really see every year is different. The world is always changing. And depending on the political situation, the economic situation, it's really quite fascinating. So the rules for choosing the films are twofold, in that film selection should be quality pictures with awards and accolades, in addition to representing an aspect of culture or society within the last year and a half. So naturally, my question then for her is, what's so appealing about showing the Dove Flyer? So in comparison to the previous festival, the Chicago Festival didn't need to show this appeal of this audience draw because of obligations or cultural commitments to ontology or audience. So in fact, the core audience for this festival are middle-aged Ashkenazi women. So Cindy's goal is to create the largest possible audience, including Israelis, non-Israelis, Jews, non-Jews, men, women, the old, and the young. So when deciding to screen the film at the Chicago Festival, Cindy's first words about it was that it was a beautiful film. She saw it as an unknown and undertold story that her core audience of Ashkenazi and Jews who immigrated from Europe would not know. This idea that they also don't know about the untold story. In actuality, the Chicago Film Festival played both a feature film and a documentary about Iraqi Jews. So there's clearly a supply of MIZRAHI narratives and films to choose from. She complimented Israel on its ability to produce great films on the budget that Hollywood has for one blockbuster. So funding for filmmaking in Israel is now becoming a more salient idea or a key issue that can explain this surge of MIZRAHI films. But to debate where that money comes from and what it's allocated to is for another day. So the Chicago Festival is committed to showing contemporary films and capturing the attitude. Stern says, I think that MIZRAHI filmmakers now, they're a part of a second generation. They're finding their voice more. They're getting more funding for their films. And I think there are people that are interested in that story now, more than perhaps in the past. Well, I don't know what it has to do with. I mean, maybe it's even wanting to, the filmmakers, or let's say the artistic community, wanting to build more bridges so these stories help with that. So she gives us an interesting explanation as to why these films specifically are so popular now. In short, the stories are being funded and people are interested in hearing and telling them. But next year, maybe it'll be a different story. And I draw this conclusion from my conversation with Cindy because while she believes in cultural exchange and diversity appreciation, she offhandedly talks about how sometimes one culture is more important than another. So the last place I interviewed was at the University of Wisconsin MADISON-HILLEL house. The Hillel mission statement right from their national website is to enrich the lives of Jewish undergraduate and graduate students so that they may enrich the Jewish people and the world. So the Hillel house at Madison answers to a larger organization, and they work with specifically an Israeli fellow. The Israeli fellow comes in for 2 years, and it's written in their guidelines that the Israeli fellow supports and manages the Israel Film Festival. So I spoke with the visiting Israel fellow there at the time, Mickey Komar. So directing the festival is part of his job, but he works with actually a group of undergraduates to help choose the film, to help plan and execute the festival. So the mission of Hillel and the exploration of Jewish identity is overshadowed by the renewed examination of Israel as a cultural platform. So what I originally thought would just be a religiously primed frame has now being conflated with ideas or representations of what Israel is like. So the theme for 2015 was the many faces of Israel. The film, or the theme for this year is actually encounters. So when I looked on the website for UW-Hillel, I noticed that most films selected featured Ashkenazim, Israeli LGBT communities, or Arab-Palestinian stories. So I gathered then that the Dove Flyer was the first storyline of its kind. Now, coincidentally, as of this morning, the same range of film topics is about the same. Something Ashkenazim, something Arab-Palestinian, something from Israeli TV, and a MIZRAHI story. So this year it's a story about a Moroccan Jew. So when I asked how they picked their films, they said they chose films for their festival based on the film festivals around them in Milwaukee and Chicago. So it's no surprise that the Chicago Festival has a direct influence on what gets played at this local university level. So from the researching phase of finding films and deciding what fits in the year's themes, the students and Mickey begin to set up marketing in the website, post trailers, contact publishing companies, and to find sponsorships. So Mickey indicated the audience's association with Hillel or Jewish identity doesn't necessarily matter when it comes to people who will show up to see the film. Students come depending on the theme, so it's strategic for them to include films that speak to more people, right? So in 2015, they had a movie that included ballroom dancing. So they paired with the ballroom dancing team at UW's campus to promote a larger audience. So even though UW-Hillel Film Festival and the Chicago Festival both market themselves as somewhat Israeli film festivals, there's one big difference to notice. As Cindy said earlier, they try to show the whole picture or reality of what happens in Israel or who is Israeli. Hillel, by comparison, is not that free. They have to maintain certain premises, like the Israeli state is secure and has solid boundaries. The Hillel cannot program anything that questions the autonomy or demonizes Israel. And this connection to a higher organization limits the content that the festival could show. And so the many faces of Israel are really the only faces of Israel deemed appropriate to show. So these ideological foundations and financial acquisitions of the festival complicate the notion of representation. So in the interest of time and the fact that I've been talking for 34 minutes straight, I'll just sort of give you my general conclusions. So the Dove Flyer is being marketed and re-contextualized in these different ways through these different spaces, right? As something tied to identity, something tied to space and identity, something tied to religion, space, and identity. And what I posit is that organizational ideology determines the frame for understanding the film. It contextualizes the film and primes the audience for what they're going to see and what affiliation they should make with it. Whether that's what you call it, how you associate it with different organizations, and it helps decide what gets selected in general, what gets represented. In turn, though, the audience can help shape that organizational ideology and how films are selected. We see that with the Sephardic community having specific pockets of groups of people, like Iraqi Jews. Financing films in terms of film production and support is an underlying threat at all times to this idea of film diversity or narrative diversity in a festival. And ultimately, film festivals function as an identity-building enterprise because they're always connecting to this larger idea of who is their audience, who are they, and who are they to serve. So, to conclude, to combat hostile and ever-shifting requirements for film festivals, the Dove flyer has to be marketed differently to fit each ideological frame. Its materiality and production value allows it to stand out in quality compared to previous films of its genre. Its uniqueness in language and content make it exotic. It draws audience members in for sheer entertainment purposes of maybe I've never seen that before. And while it draws Iraqi Jews in to watch their experience, it also draws Jews and non-Jews to hear a story often unknown. It allures audience members with its alterity and its exoticism, but it straddles ideological attachments constantly to Israel. It's this negotiation of ideological commitments that makes the film so amenable to the different ideological bases of the film festivals. The film can play to the cultural appreciation of the Sephardic Jewish experience. It can create the dialogue of cultural exchange sought in Chicago. And it can show off the quality of work in Israeli cinema. So the film was re-textualized in film festivals across America, and each director identified a different ideology behind the festival and rules on how to choose films. But the film itself was both adapted and adaptable to these frames. So for me, the point of all of this is that Mizrahi representation in films is still contingent on dominant ideology's influence. Whether or not funding can be obtained, how can it circulate in these spaces of ideas? So competing against other sexy cultures at the time and films involving the Arab conflict, Mizrahi narratives depend on their popularity and relevance at the time to stay included in the conversation. This contingency on temporal significance means that the unknown stories of Mizrahim are here today and may be gone tomorrow. These narratives, the narrative inclusion in film festivals depends on too many factors of the festival and the market itself in order to reflect a respected and separate narrative that should be in Israeli culture. They would need to be present in the film festival for years to come in order to prove that it has become a staple in Israeli cinema the same way Ashkenazi stories have. So, thank you for listening. I'm sure you might have a lot of questions on things that I might not have answers to, but I'm happy to answer any that you have. Oh, sorry, please.
I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about the financing of the film and the production of the film.
I can't.
Okay.
I can only tell you it's made in Israel.
Yeah.
It was made it's sponsored by the Israeli Film Fund and the British Film Fund. They sort of work together. That's about the extent. That is a totally separate thing that would need way more time. So, good question. Yeah, and that's it.
First of all, let me thank you for getting us off to a wonderful start for our activities this year. That was really interesting. I have two questions. One is more of a point to bring to your attention, and it's fairly minor. But you said that the dialect is the Baghdad dialect that the Jews and Muslims of Baghdad speak. I wonder a bit about that, because there is a distinct Jewish dialect in Baghdad, as there's a distinct Christian dialect, both of which are actually older than the Muslim dialect of Baghdad for various historical reasons. And although educated Jews and Christians can speak the Muslim dialect, when they speak the Muslims amongst themselves, they speak in their own dialect. So that's something I would look at a bit more closely, perhaps. It would be surprising if the film were made in the Baghdad Muslim dialect, because there's a vibrant, or at least there was a vibrant, Jewish dialect-based literature, they're still writing poetry and so on in the Jewish dialect of Baghdad. It's just unfortunately no longer in Baghdad, it's in Tel Aviv or wherever.
Great.
So that's something I would actually wonder if you might be worthwhile to look at. I would expect this not to be in the same dialect, say, for us. That's the minor point. I wonder, though, if you could pause and talk a little bit about the I think it was the Chicago gentleman who insisted on Sephardic rather than Mizrahi.
Oh, right,
If I
yeah.
have it. I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit. That actually interested me because it seems to me, among other things, Mizrahi is a claim, and it may have many other significances, but one of them, it seems to me, is a claim of belonging to the Arab countries from which the Arab Jews fled. And somehow it seems to me, and of course it's from my field obviously, but it seems to me that forcing them into a claim of being Sephardic is to say that there's sort of a different diaspora within the diaspora. And that I found very interesting. And I wonder if you thought about that and what you think.
Yeah, well, so I mostly, when I talk about Jews who do not come from Eastern Europe, I almost exclusively use the word Mizrahi or Mizrahi. So when I was interviewing Neil Sheff of the Sephardic Jewish Film Festival in LA, he made a huge point to say, oh, no, say Sephardic. And I asked, why? Can't I use both? Or like, isn't Sephardic just for Spanish Jews? And he said, well, our SEC president, the Sephardic Educational Center president, she had a whole big talk on this, and Sephardic's just more inclusive, at least for them. Sephardic is more inclusive because it can span North Africa and the Middle East in a way that Mizrahi, just the actual word Mizrah, to be east, implies a location of only Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Iraq. And that excludes Persia, it excludes Ethiopia. So their political leaning was that Sephardic was just more inclusive. Although, in the things I've read, that's not the general way people talk about Jews that are not Eastern European. They're mostly just referred to as Mizrahi. And then as for the dialect question, so if my ear was better, I could watch the film and see if there's code switching in the actual scenes where they go from private to public space, because that would be significant if the code switching was shown, at least in the film. Yeah.
Can you put it into a broader context of popular culture? Your talk focused mostly on American film festivals, and that is a very interesting subject in itself, but the film is not made for Americans. The film is made for Israelis. And what is happening in Israeli popular culture, and maybe even higher culture,
Yeah, so
that promotes this and results in this kind of a film?
So what I've seen, at least in the last 3 years, is that at least when we think of cinema, it's starting to include more of these stories. So the cool thing about this film and the next year's film, actually, they were both submitted for Ophir's, or like the Academy Awards in Israel, and the Dove Flyer won for Best Israeli Film. The next year, Baba Jun, which is a film about Persian Jews, was entirely in Persian or in Farsi, and also won the best film. So we're seeing this switch, or we're at least seeing an increase. There's more of an emphasis on these untold stories, but the question is how long. The question is, can we see it over a group over a space or a time? So over the last 2 years, it's kind of hard to say if there's this bigger appreciation, because it just hasn't stood up to this long history of Ashkenazim stories. So I'll get back to you in 10 years.
But can you look back and see where this is coming from?
Well, if we compare it to the Reka films.
And not just films. Popular music, foodways, dress, even the Hebrew language.
Right. Well, that's my dissertation. So let's talk about it. So, if depending on who you ask, right? Some of these forms, these like hybrid Arab Jewish expressions of culture, music and film and literature especially, they get taken up in different places. So on the one hand, they're really unique expressions of this community of people. This group of people usually they're bilingual, they can speak Arabic and Hebrew, but it kind of depends on who you're talking about, right? So there are singers who, like Sahaba Ben, who is Arab Israeli or Arab Jewish, and she's one of the more popular examples of someone using their identity and being successful at it. Whereas other Arab minorities in the space aren't so inclined to promote that side of themselves. So depending on if you look at a Bedouin or Druze, they might not speak Arabic, or they might not speak Arabic in the street, but they might speak it at home. And in terms of looking at MIZRAHI in film, even in the Bureka films, like Salah Shabadi was one of the examples I had posted, is a 1964 film with the famous actor who plays Tebia in Fiddler on the Roof. And that film is entirely in Hebrew, but follows the trajectory of Moroccan immigrants, of Moroccan Jews to Israel. So I think it depends. It kind of depends on your focus, but you can see a variety of expressions. We'll see. Yeah.
I have kind of a follow-up question from what Steve was asking. The Bureka films, they came out at a moment where, in music as well, there was this profound development of an indigenous Mizrahi popular music, largely the development of the cassette tape and the bus station music, the Musika Yom Tachonet. All these things, they came in at the same time as this kind of Bureka film movement. I'm wondering if this film we're talking about today is an outlier to a larger I guess what I'm wondering is, who is telling this story? Is it Mizrahi telling their story, or is it an Ashkenazi kind of cultural formation looking to exoticize an Israeli historical narrative that's not well known? Or is it more like the Bureka films or Musika Yom Tachonet, where the Mizrahi are basically creating a music that reflects their cultural formation for themselves?
Right. So the idea that, the funny thing about Salah Shabadi is that it's a Bureka film. It's a criticism of how Arab Jews were treated when they came to Israel after the expulsion from their Arab homelands. And the story is directed by an Ashkenazi satirical writer, right? So on the one hand, these are intricately related in the idea that they're working together to make films. But the idea that they're being exposed for exoticism, I think, came out in a lot of the different ways people talked about this film specifically, in that it's different. It's got Arabic in it, and it's in a different part of the land. And I think that exoticism can be detrimental to the idea that they're somehow not equal, or they're exotic and thus distance themselves from us, right? Because they sound like that they're the other. When it should be a reflection of what made up Israeli identity in its most primary stage.
So what role do festivals play in that othering process that you're talking about?
Well, we're talking about American festivals, right?
Right,
So
right.
The only way to fully know that is to do ethnographic studies on how the audience interpreted what they saw.
Yeah, sure.
Right?
Sure. I think Steve's point about the movie being made for Israelis, yet screened internationally in the U.S. for an American jury is an important one to kind of critically unpack. And the framing that you're using is really well done. A lot of the framing literature talks about the violence of the frame, and that might be a place where you could further pursue the representation of Mizrahim, the otherness that occurs as a result of the representation, and how festivals can contribute to that kind of violence.
Nice. Thank you.
You mentioned at the beginning that this movie was screened in 48 other countries, and the US is one of them. Do you have, I know that your research is mainly concerned with the reception in the United States, but do you have a sense of what's the reason for including it in a film festival in Ghana? Where do you have a sense that the frames or the overall context internationally is very different to the one in the United States?
Yeah, so the cool thing about the Ghana one is that it was shown for Israelis living in Ghana, ironically enough. So at least when they're used in these other spaces, like Jewish spaces internationally, they're used as like a rallying tool or something to like come together over in terms of camaraderie. So I think that's what's interesting, at least for internationally, who they're playing for. So one of the spaces I was looking at was like congregations using them to talk about the sort of the Jewish experience from others, but it's still religiously charged. So I think it reflects on the identity of who your audience is going to be in different spaces.
It's kind of like a weird follow-up. Where in Ghana is there a Jewish population? I've been there, and I've only ever seen Christians and Muslims.
Well, it was played at the ministry. So the Israeli ministry to Ghana.
I'm assuming that was an opera. All right, yeah, I've only ever been to like northern area. I've never seen a Jew in Ghana, and I've been there 5 times. So.
Oh, right on. Well, next time.
Yeah.
My first sight of a black man in Israel was when a truck full of Ghanaians were traveling through the country.
Yeah.
Israel has very strong, intimate, and historically from the 1950s, relations with Ghana. And Israel has its own foreign aid program. And there is a great deal being done in Africa, particularly in Ghana. And there are many Israelis who are in Ghana on an advisory capacity. Medical, agricultural, technological, there's a great deal of that going on. Maybe you don't see them, but I guess they should kind of stand out. But yeah, my daughter didn't see them either. She wasn't looking for them. She was looking for Ghanaians. She found them. I wanted to add a little bit more about context because there's a great deal that needs to be looked at here for the Israelis. For example, I wonder who in Israel is listening or watching this film without subtitles. I think as Ambassador Istrabadi mentioned, even those who came from Iraq would have difficulty following. I myself don't know the dialect, but very likely this would have a permanent subtitle system of Hebrew, at least, if not English as well, on it.
I don't want to we can understand each other. But the generality, you can hear the difference between the Jewish dialect of Baghdad and the Christian dialect of Baghdad.
Well,
which are, by the way, rather related to one another.
Right, and those who left Baghdad are 80 years old nowadays and more.
Right. The second generation wave.
Second generation is pretty much kind of lightly endowed with Arabic and dialect, period. So that is part, but there's a great deal of interesting resurgence of the other in Israeli culture nowadays. The majority, yes, it's Ashkenazi by and large, but there's a great deal of ferment that is happening in various literary and pop culture, music, and the arts. Orthodox Judaism is being featured in films nowadays. Various Arab-speaking groups, whether they are Israeli or come from other parts of the world. What intrigues me is this insistence of identifying Sephardi and MIZRAHI as being equal, analogous, similar. They're very different, as you say. One comes from Spanish heritage, mostly from the Eastern Mediterranean, Greece, Turkey, Egypt, the Levant. And the Mizrahim are, curiously, not just from the East, but all along North Africa. So this person in LA was talking Californian, and I don't understand Californian English. They're very different. No.
Where do you put the Moroccan Jews as against?
Well, they would say they're Moroccans, and you can't argue with them because there are so many of them. And they would just argue you down. However, to create a generality, there is the notion of the MIZRAHI Jew. And that's like saying Near Eastern languages and cultures, and we're dealing with Morocco. I mean, that's the Maghreb, not the Mashriq. So it's not exactly Near Eastern, it's North African. But the term is used with great deal of levity in this case. However, each one identifies himself ethnically as being very different. Algerians and Moroccans and Tunisians and Egyptians and Libyans are very different from one another. They may not even speak each other's language. But there's a kind of an easy way of trying to include them. I'll stop.
I had a meeting, but I couldn't come earlier. But I want to comment on the Moroccan. I was in Morocco a couple of months ago, and when the taxi driver passed by the Jewish cemetery, he stopped with all respect and pointed this out to us. And he said, "This is the Jewish cemetery." And I was really intrigued by that. The respect, even the taxi driver.
Maybe he thought you were Jewish.
Maybe. You're a cousin in you.
It's all in the family.
Yes.
Well, on that note, thank you guys so much for coming. I'll end us just a little bit early because I have to go teach. But thank you so much for coming, and please reach out to me if you have any questions or comments. I was so willing for feedback, so thank you.